Okay, comrades and friends, this is going to be a sort of meandering excursion into the realm of myth and folklore with the assistance of Marxist theory as our kind of compass. And right at the outset, therefore, because that's what it's going to be about, I want to say that I am not going to talk about the commercialisation of Christmas, which is what everybody says about Christmas. It's all commercialised. Of course it's commercialised because we live in a capitalist society and they turn everything into a commodity. If they are turning our hospitals and healthcare into commodities, they are bound to turn Christmas into a commodity. Of course it's the case that, as far as capital is concerned, Christmas every year is an opportunity to try and persuade people to spend lots of money in order to make profit for capitalists. That much is obvious. Every society creates a Christmas in its own image, and it's been like that for some time. I mean, certainly back into the 1930s, and I put this up because one of the myths of Father Christmas is that he, at least his red outfit is invented by Coca-Cola in the 1930s, and that he appears for the first time in his red outfit, his red and white outfit, on Coca-Cola advertisements in the 1930s, which is not actually true. It's an accident, an unfortunate cultural accident, that Father Christmas wore red and white, and those are also the colours of the Coca-Cola logo. But it was put to good use, as you can see, as far as Coca-Cola was concerned, in the 1930s. Now, that's all we're going to do on the commercialisation of Christmas, because there are actually much more interesting things to be said about it. And what I really want to do is to tease out how within this thing that has been developing for actually thousands of years, there is contradiction and conflict actually represented in the folklore and in the myth and so on. There are different messages that are being communicated through this tradition. And we're going to start with just a little bit of theory. I'm going to say a few things about myth, and then I'm going to, in a sense, the rest of the talk, the rest of the introduction is an attempt to apply these generalizations about myth to the particular set of myths and traditions and folklore and so on that we're concerned with at Christmas. For those of you who are anthropology students, the quotation comes from Claude Lévi-Strauss, who's the very famous social anthropologist, who talked about myths being good to think with. And that is how they're used in traditional society, and I think to some degree in modern society too. We use myths, we use stories, traditional stories, as ways of thinking about and discussing the human condition and the relationship between human beings and nature, and for those human beings who have a relationship with a god or gods, the relationship with them, and most importantly perhaps, the relationships between different human beings and groups of human beings. Myth is about exploring all of these things. And that means that myth is contradictory and changeable. And that's because society is contradictory and changeable. So that when we look at myth and we begin to sort of peel back the layers, we discover that there are all sorts of conflicts that are being represented in the stories, and we also find that the stories are changing. They're constantly being reinvented over time. And myths are therefore subject to a number of cultural processes. They're subject to a process of invention. Myths, traditions, folklore has to be created at some point, and in actual fact it's changing all the time, so it's constantly being invented and reinvented. There is an inflation of some myths. Some myths grow and become very important, and other myths do not. And different mythic traditions or folklore traditions interact with each other. So these processes create great complexity. And there's also a process of compression. Sometimes different stories are getting squeezed into one. Sometimes there's conflation. In other words, different mythological traditions are getting blended together to create a single outcome, and we're going to see a very clear example when I talk about Father Christmas himself. And this means myth is complex, it's multi-layered, and it contains many different meanings. And if you are a Marxist, what you're interested in doing is teasing out the meanings that are reflecting social contradiction and social conflict, and that's what we're going to try and do this evening. Let's take an example of the invention of tradition, first of all. This is a phrase that was used by the great, just late historian Eric Hobsbawm, and he was talking in particular about actually the invention of tradition in the 19th century. Christmas as we have it now is an example of the invention of tradition. A lot of what is now considered to be traditional was imported from an existing but developing Germanic tradition when Prince Albert married Queen Victoria, and that the way in which the Victorian court began to celebrate Christmas under Germanic influence was then reflected in the behaviour of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. So you have a royal Christmas, a royal Victorian Christmas, and you have a bourgeois Victorian Christmas which is mimicking it, notably with the Christmas tree that seems to arrive at this time, but doesn't, as far as I can tell, penetrate the working class, which is quite interesting. There was quite for a long, long time, there was a real barrier. And I'm going to talk about the Christmas Truce in 1914 towards the end of the talk. It's interesting that, but I'll just mention this point about it now, when the German soldiers put up Christmas trees on their parapet of their trenches in 1914, the British Tommies didn't know what they were. So as late as 1914, it was not a working class tradition to actually have Christmas trees. This is very much a certain social class which is celebrating Christmas in this way. And an invented traditional Christmas which is popularised most famously, of course, by Charles Dickens, because Charles Dickens's Christmas is a reflection very much of this new Germanic influenced idea which is growing in the mid-Victorian period. I put up one of the famous original illustrations that we used to illustrate Dickens's book. This is Fezziwig's Christmas ball from A Christmas Carol, a story which I'm going to return to a little bit later, but at this stage I just want to say about Dickens that Dickens is part of this popularisation of a certain way of celebrating Christmas. Now, inevitably I'm going to have to say something about God, one particular God who's become very closely associated with Christmas. So this is a bit of a digression about the Nativity. Let me say first of all, this is not the real meaning of Christmas, which we are invited to believe by numerous cardinals and bishops and parish priests and so on. It's an invented tradition, actually, but this particular festival is a celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ, because actually nobody has the slightest idea when Jesus was born, and in fact there's a whole lot of other stuff about Jesus which needs to be unpacked. So this is a sort of short digression, okay, on the subject of Jesus, an aside on Jesus the revolutionary, who of course said that it is easier to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, and he meant that very seriously. One of the problems that we have with the Gospels, the four canonical Gospels, which are the ones that become part of the New Testament, the Christian New Testament, is they're all written between 70 and 100 AD. That is a generation or two generations after the life and mission of Jesus Christ by people who didn't know him. And the Gospels therefore have a Pauline, Christian, invented gloss which does not reflect the original mission, the character of the original mission. And I want to say one or two things about that original mission. because Palestine in the 1st century AD was a ferment of debate, of dissent, of resistance. If you read the main contemporary historical source for this, Josephus, he describes one clash after another between Jewish crowds and the security forces, one outbreak of banditry after another, one Messiah being raised up and creating a messianic movement after another, and then the whole thing completely exploding in AD 66, and he provides us with a detailed description of that conflict. It really was an absolute ferment. I mean, one needs to sort of picture, the situation in, major European capital cities in the 1960s and the 1970s to get a sense of this kind of vibrant left and militant mass movement. That's the context of Jesus' mission. So let me provide you with a few pass notes on Jesus. He was not a god. He never claimed to be a god. And he could not have made such a blasphemous claim in a contemporary Judaic context, because Judaism is strictly monotheistic. He could not actually have made that claim, and didn't make it, I'm certain. The idea that Jesus was a god was an invention of St. Paul, who was a rich, conservative, Hellenized Jew who never knew Jesus. Many early Christians, interestingly, accepted that he was not in fact a god, and denied the divinity of God. I mean, this has to be fought for and established by the Christian hierarchy, this interpretation of Jesus. What he was actually was a Jewish prophet and a preacher and a politico-religious leader, and he was politically aligned to the left, on the left. And some people recognised him at the time as the Messiah. Now that has a very specific meaning in radical Judaism in the 1st century AD. It means a particular type of religious, politico-religious leader, prophet, for the end of days, for a final settling of accounts with foreign invaders and the ruling class, and a restoration of things as they should be. This is the apocalypse, which makes possible. The apocalypse is the political victory, it's the revolution, if you like, which makes possible the Jubilee, which is a restoration of land to the people, the freeing of slaves, and so on. There was, in radical Judaism in the 1st century AD, there was this very powerful idea, and some people recognised Jesus, among many others, let me say, as the Messiah. And then we get this Christian gloss. Now I'm going to give you, when the Gospels are written, I'm just going to say this about it. I'm going to give you one example, because the trick is to read the same story in different Gospels. And if you do that, you can strip away the Christian gloss sometimes and see the original. This is what they tell us that Jesus said if you read Matthew. Blessed, this is the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Okay, it's being presented as metaphor. If you read the version in Luke, you get closer to what I think must have been the original. Because what Jesus actually said was very different. He said, blessed are ye that hunger now, for ye shall be filled. Not hunger after righteousness, just hunger. Ye shall be filled. But woe unto you who are rich. Matthew's forgotten this bit completely. Woe unto you who are rich, for ye have received your consolation. Woe unto you that are full, for ye shall hunger. This is a clarion call to class war. And my Jesus doesn't think much of meek and mild. My Jesus is in the context very much of this revolutionary ferment in Palestine at the time. Now, this is a digression, a rather long digression, for which I apologise. What's it all got to do with Christmas? The answer is absolutely nothing at all, because Christmas is an ancient pagan fertility festival, which at some point is taken over by the Christian Church. One of my archaeological colleagues, who's somewhat irreverent, like many archaeologists I suppose, turned it into this cartoon. He's imagining a scene taking place somewhere in Britain, round about 300 AD, and he's depicting the process of Christian conversion, including the Christian takeover of Christmas, or what they turn into Christmas. The reality is that to understand what this tradition is, we have to go back much further beyond the development of the Christian tradition. Now, this is where we begin to delve into this meandering labyrinth that is myth, and specifically Teutonic myth. Though I'm going to start with Celtic myth, which is different, because I think there is a link. I think there's a bit of the old Celtic myth that provides a kind of substratum for the later development of the festival. Now, insofar as there is a Celtic Christmas, and I'm going to continue to use the word Christmas, though it's obviously the wrong word to use when you're talking about this period and this interpretation of the festival, it's not really Christmas at all, because of course Samhain, which is the if you like the winter festival of the Celtic religion. Samhain takes place at the end of October. It is a harvest festival, essentially, because it takes place immediately after the harvest has been gathered. It represents the beginning of the Celtic New Year. It's the end of the old year and the beginning of the new, and of course it is our Halloween. Now, I want to make a couple of interpretive comments about this festival. What is being celebrated in the Celtic tradition is coming out of the light of the summer, the light of the sunshine, the light that is the giver of fertility, of the abundance which farmers need, into the darkness of winter, which is a period of anxiety for people who live a traditional farming life, because they need the return of spring, they need the return of summer if they are to survive, and they're worried too about their ability to get through the winter. There's also a sense in which, as you move from one time period to another, there is a kind of crack in time, where two bits of time, in a sense, join together. That is, if you like, a liminal space, a space that is neither one thing nor the other, not summer, not winter, but the moment of transition between the two, when the crack is an opening to the other side. And that is why the spirits walk at this time. That is why there is a sense that the ancestors, the ghosts, those from the other side are able to be all around us at this moment in time, because it's a liminal space, a liminal time. Now, there's a bit of that old Celtic tradition that I think then feeds in to the way in which what becomes Christmas, our Christmas, develops. But it's mainly Teutonic myth that I want to talk about. And in talking about Teutonic myth, Germanic myth, I'm going to introduce our main character, Father Christmas. And here, by the way, is an example of the invention of tradition, because of course he doesn't originally wear red and white. As we see him now, he is in a kind of disguise. We're going to rip that disguise off and expose the real Father Christmas. He wasn't originally dressed in red and white. That's an invention of the Americans in the middle of the 19th century. In particular, an American artist called Thomas Nast, who depicted Father Christmas for the first time wearing the traditional gear. And this is actually Nast's cartoon, the most famous of a number of cartoons that he did of Father Christmas. So there is invention of tradition going on here in the way in which Father Christmas is being changed. But there's also, what's also happening is there is conflation of tradition. In other words, there are different traditions being joined together in the person of Father Christmas. Here's one tradition which is developing over here, and then we're going to join it up to another tradition developing in another place at another time. One tradition is the tradition of St. Nicholas, a saint of the Balkans and Central and Eastern Europe, who is traditionally a benefactor, a giver of offerings to the poor, donations to the poor, and to children, poor children in particular. And he's a saint who's sort of worshipped in the Eastern Christian tradition still. He is the Sinterklaas who is honoured as Father Christmas in other parts of Europe, particularly in the Low Countries a little bit later. And Sinterklaas is Americanized into Santa Claus, partly because the Dutch settlers in the United States brought Sinterklaas with them, and most Americans wanted something that was a bit more user-friendly to English speakers, so it becomes Santa Claus. Our Santa Claus is Saint Nicholas, and of course he comes to be equated with Father Christmas. But actually, Father Christmas is another tradition developing alongside Santa Claus, Sinterklaas, Saint Nicholas. Let's explore that a little further. Who is Father Christmas? And there's a sort of subsidiary question: why does he come down the chimney? And he's been coming down the chimney for a long while, because this is a 17th century Dutch painting, and can you see the Dutch children are playing with their toys, but some of them are peering up the chimney, which is where Sinterklaas has come from. Who is he? He's a number of different mythic, folkloric characters. He is the Green Man. Now, the Green Man is deeply rooted in English folk culture and other folk cultures as well. There are representations of the Green Man all across medieval art and later art as well. You can go into a lot of churches and you will see sort of representations of the Green Man, who is obviously, there's just 4 examples selected at random there. So this is something that goes back a very, very long way, and of course is essentially pagan. This is a representation of fertility, of natural abundance, and so on, the Green Man. And we have, the Green Man pops up in interesting places. So the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the 12th century romance about King Arthur's court, Camelot. This is a medieval story about the Green Man, this traditional fertility, whatever he is, deity of some kind, spirit of some kind, that exists out there in the landscape. And lo and behold, Father Christmas didn't originally wear red. Father Christmas originally wore green. Father Christmas is the Green Man. Father Christmas is an evolution of this traditional idea of a friendly spirit that is a spirit of fertility that is out there in the landscape. It's very, very deep rooted in English-speaking culture. But he's not just that, because I said I was going to talk about the Germans' Teutonic myth. And that too is very relevant to understanding, to identifying this character that we now see in disguise. He's not just the Celtic and the medieval Green Man, he is also Teutonic, Wotan, or Woden, as the Anglo-Saxons called him, or Odin, as the Scandinavians, the Norse, the Vikings called him. And we can actually see in literary descriptions of Woden, Odin, and in artistic representations, we can see the transition towards something recognisably like our Father Christmas. I selected these examples at random. Here's a 17th century representation, and Father Christmas here, it's a Scandinavian Father Christmas, who bears an extraordinary resemblance to this modern cartoon version of Odin, which is based upon descriptions in the Norse sagas, or this 19th century representation, not of Father Christmas, but of Odin, but Odin looking distinctly now like the traditional Father Christmas, and there he is again in his green gear. This is the Teutonic Father Christmas. This is the form of Father Christmas traditionally imagined in many parts of Northern Europe, right up to the present, because Father Christmas is not red everywhere. I mean, even today, Father Christmas is green still in lots of places. The changing face, this is the changing face of Woden, Odin, who morphs into Father Christmas. And I just want, this is another sort of little aside, really. I just want to say something about how this folk tradition is actually surviving through long periods of time, because I think it is. Because there is a very sharp dichotomy in medieval English culture between an elite of foreign conquerors who spoke Norman French and an Anglo-Saxon peasantry who were actually descended from Neolithic farmers, but they adopted Anglo-Saxon culture. A very, very sharp sense of a cultural conflict, which was also, of course, a class conflict. So here are my sullen medieval Saxons contrasted with these foreign conquerors. And of course, Norman feudalism was a brutal kind of feudalism. The Norman lords simply took all of the land, all of it. It was the biggest land grab in the whole of British history. They took the whole lot. They imposed themselves on the landscape, and they remained culturally distinct for a very, very long period of time. They say that Henry V in the early 15th century was the first English king who could actually speak English as his first language. I mean, the separation between the elite and the mass of the population was quite extreme for a very long time in the medieval world. So you had two very different cultures developing, so much so that in the 17th century, revolutionaries still talked about the Norman yoke. And what they meant by the Norman yoke was the yoke that had been imposed by the Norman conquest. In other words, an aristocracy controlled by a court that was basically descended from foreign conquerors. So they were busy doing some unyoking by chopping off Charles I's head, of course, in the middle of the 17th century. Now, the reason I say all this is because I think there is an underlying folk tradition that's carrying on through. An underlying folk tradition that's carrying on from Anglo-Saxon times through the medieval period into much more recent times, certainly into the 17th century and then beyond. And it's to do with an ancient fertility cult that probably goes back many thousands of years. Stonehenge is essentially a temple for doing two things: for worshipping the sun, imagined to be a god, of course a god of fertility, and for disposing of the dead and having the dead pass from this side to the other side. In other words, it's about ancestor cult as well. It's essentially what Stonehenge is. And the winter solstice is of huge significance, because this is the moment of transition from one year to the next, the moment of transition when you've passed the worst of winter and you're moving towards the spring and the summer, and this crack in time, this liminal space where many things are possible, such as the dead walking again among the living, which is why the midwinter solstice is associated with fertility cult. It's associated with green men. The green man of the medieval world probably goes back many thousands of years, and it's associated with ancestor worship, because it is at this time that the dead can walk among the living. So you also have the idea of ghosts associated not just with Halloween, but obviously also with Christmas. There is lots in the traditional Christmas now that links back to this pagan, folklore, mythic tradition. Those elves toiling away in the North Pole right now to make toys for children are Anglo-Saxon elves. And Anglo-Saxon elves were creatures of the wood who reflected the most basic substratum of pagan religion, which is animism. Animism is the idea that all natural things are infused with a spirit presence. The springs, the rivers, the mountains, the woods, the trees, and so on. That's where they come from. Those elves who are now sort of busy making toys for children. Take the example, here's another example, of the Yule log. The Yule log has morphed, of course. This is an early 19th century print showing people hauling in the Yule log, which traditionally in the Teutonic and the Scandinavian tradition is burnt on the fire. Fire, of course, is a symbol of life. Bringing the log is itself, it's a bit of a tree, it's a symbol of fertility. So you burn the log and you renew the life. And we turn it into a lump of chocolate today. But the reason why we turn it into a lump of chocolate is because we have this folk tradition which is going back a very, very long way. Mistletoe, likewise, is referred to in very early sources. Actually, the Celtic Druids are described by the Greek and Roman writers as cutting the sacred mistletoe from oak trees, and we still have it today as, of course, and there it is, a symbol of fertility, which is why people kiss underneath the mistletoe. All of these things are going back way beyond the development of the Christian tradition. So who is Father Christmas? Can we now expose him? He is Saint Nicholas. He is the Viking god Odin. He is the Green Man. He is a spirit of winter, fertility, and benevolence, and he's the divine ancestor of the people's king, because the Anglo-Saxon kings claimed descent from Woden, from Wotan, and that mattered in the medieval period when the lords were Norman, and people thought of the Anglo-Saxon kings. They weren't benevolent, but people thought they were benevolent, or many people did in the medieval period. And he comes down the chimney because the hearth, the fire and the log symbolise fertility. Plus, I've suggested the chimney is a bit Freudian. Now, there is something else. And this is where we find something that is more contested, something that is more controversial, something that is more deeply hidden in the tradition. The Roman version of the midwinter festival that we're talking about is the Saturnalia. And one of the interesting things about the Saturnalia is that pretty well anything went in the Saturnalia. It was a liberation from restriction, from law, from control, from authority, from hierarchy, so much so that traditionally masters and slaves would change places in the Roman household, and the masters would serve the slaves. In other words, for a moment in time, it was the world turned upside down. That tradition survived for a very long time. The Roman Saturnalia survived through the medieval period as the Feast of Fools. Still takes place, not necessarily on the 25th, it could be the 25th of December, but in the middle of December or early January. It's the same time of year. It's the midwinter festival. And what traditionally happens in the medieval Feast of Fools is that an ordinary person, very often a poor person, sometimes even a disabled person, very often a young person, is crowned for the day, and they become the Pope, or the Cardinal, or the Bishop, or the Abbot. And then anything goes on the streets. Now this was a fairly subversive event, so much so that the medieval authorities periodically tried to clamp down on it, because all sorts of unrepeatable things tended to be said on these occasions about popes and cardinals and bishops and abbots and other such people. So the Feast of Fools was a very, very controversial and festival with a real subversive cutting edge to it. The Feast of Fools is the occasion when a lord of misrule is created. Interesting. a lord of misrule, a lord for when the world has been turned upside down and we don't have proper rule, but some other kind of rule that isn't right in some way. That is a rule where the common people, for a day, are in charge of what's going on. This is I think this is the Lord of Misrule depicted here in Bruegel's famous painting. Now, let me say something about Saturn, who is the source of this. The Saturnalia is the feast of Saturn, the mid-winter feast of the Greco-Roman god Saturn. That becomes the Feast of Fools, that creates the Lord of Misrule, that creates this festival that goes right through, certainly to the 16th century in parts of Europe. Who is Saturn? He was the god of agriculture, time, and freedom. And he ruled during a golden age. This is Greco-Roman myth. He ruled during a golden age at the dawn of time, which was a time of equality and peace, which we do not live in now. He is the same as the Greek Kronos, and the Romans sometimes equated Saturn with the Punic god, the Carthaginian god Baal, and they sometimes equated him with the Jewish god Yahweh or Jehovah. And there's an interesting link here with the Judaic tradition. The myth describes the class struggle at the dawn of time between the forces that represent equality and peace and the forces that represent a new kind of order which is being forged by the overthrow of Saturn Kronos. Saturn Kronos knew what was coming. He knew the counter-revolution was coming, and he tried to prevent it by eating all of the potential leaders of the counter-revolution. So Kronos Saturn devoured his own children to safeguard his throne and to preserve the golden age, but unsuccessfully, because he was overthrown and a new reign was established, the reign of Zeus, the Greek Zeus, the Roman Jupiter, who is a god of patriarchy, a god of hierarchy, a god of war, and a god of empire. The age we live in now, the age they lived in then when these myths were being created 2,500 years ago. But there was this sense that there was an earlier time, which was a better time, and it was the time of Saturn. And just for one day each year, we return in the imagination and we return in our celebrations to the reign of Saturn. That is the essence of the Saturnalia. And if the Romans were equating Saturn with Yahweh, with Jehovah, they had a reason for doing that, and it is this: that tradition of a lost golden age that we should be trying to return to is there in the Jewish tradition also. There is a Jewish tradition of apocalypse, and this tradition is represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what the Dead Sea Scrolls do is they describe a revolutionary insurrection by the poor against the ruling class in Palestine in the 1st century AD, and against the Greeks and the Romans who were dominant. And they use language in the Dead Sea Scrolls like this. This is from the War Scroll, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They say, "Thou," that is addressed to God, "thou wilt deliver into the hands of the poor the enemies from all the lands, to humble the might of the peoples by the hand of those bent to the dust, to bring upon the head of thine enemies the reward of the wicked. We will despise kings, we will mock and scorn the mighty, for our Lord is holy, and the King of glory is with us together with the holy ones." The Dead Sea Scrolls are a clarion call to class war, a clarion call to class war that is also reflected in some parts of the Judaic and the Christian Bible, in the book of Revelation, for example, but there are other apocalyptic passages where there is a discussion of class war and the possibility of a great conflagration, a great insurrection that is going to cleanse the world of iniquity, of injustice, of inequality. It envisages a war of liberation. In other words, the apocalypse, the Judeo-Christian apocalypse, envisages a war of liberation, and that war of liberation will make possible the People's Jubilee. And it had a very specific meaning in the ancient tradition. It meant cancellation of debts, it meant emancipation of slaves, and it meant redistribution of land. And those are the demands of the ancient left again and again and again. That's what it meant. And it produced this vision of a world transformed, produced explosive revolts on 3 occasions in Palestine. 3 great Jewish revolts in an attempt to realise the apocalypse and to realise the Jubilee. That tradition survives. That Judeo-Christian apocalyptic tradition survives through the medieval period. It's represented by millenarian radicalism. It's represented by a form of radicalism which exists right up into the 16th, into the 17th century, where people, when they made revolution, they still made revolution fighting under the banner of God, or a God, their God. They still believed that to make revolution you needed God on your side, and they still imagined, if they were poor especially, because the poor are weak, and the enemy seemed so strong, they would need God on their side if they were going to win. Right up into the 16th and the 17th century, this millenarian tradition survives of an apocalyptic struggle at the end of time where God will reinforce the forces of the poor. Here, for example, is a Dutch Anabaptist in the early 16th century who is describing the radical Reformation and what their aspiration is. And he says, this is a pamphlet that's been disseminated in the cities of Holland. And accordingly, everything which has served the purposes of self-seeking and private property, such as buying and selling, working for money, taking interest and practicing usury, even at the expense of unbelievers, or eating and drinking the sweat of the poor, that is making one's own people and fellow creatures work so that one can grow fat. And indeed, everything which offends against love, all such things are abolished amongst us by the power of love and community, and knowing that God now desires to abolish such abominations. God, in other words, is part of the revolutionary process in the 16th and the 17th century, and the revolutionaries are drawing on this tradition that goes right back to the Judeo-Christian tradition of apocalypse. Now, let's finish off with some serious theory. Let's try and apply some of these generalizations to this icon of modern the modern sort of Christmas, really. This, I have to say, this is one of my, every time this is on telly, I sit down and watch it with my kids. I absolutely love this story, A Christmas Carol. And it's because there is a radical content to it, but you have to work quite hard to get to it. Scrooge, of course, is the personification of capital. He's the embodiment of the idea that what life is about is the accumulation of capital, the accumulation of profit. And he's a supreme representative of modern neoliberal capitalism, which essentially has the view that nothing matters, nobody matters, society doesn't matter, provided one is free to enrich oneself at everybody else's expense. That's the kind of society we live in today, and Scrooge is a personification of it. But, of course, he is plagued by spirits, and in particular, he's plagued by Father Christmas, because the spirit of Christmas present we now recognise as Father Christmas. He's not yet wearing his red and white outfit, and that's because he still is closer to the Green Man and to Odin, but Dickens actually does have a representation of Father Christmas in the traditional story. And the outcome, as everybody knows, because it's a very famous story, is that the world is turned upside down, isn't it? Scrooge ceases to be a mean, grasping capitalist and becomes something else. but it's only on Christmas. It's only at Christmas, only for a day, only by gift from above, and it's only pretend, of course, because it's only a story. And therefore, I want to suggest to you that the best way to conclude is for us to understand that there is a subversive message buried in all of this Christian festivity that we need to tease out, not with a view to turning the world upside down just for a day, but with a view to turning the world upside down for good, as revolutionaries in Britain attempted to do in the 17th century. There's this very famous representation of the world turned upside down, everything gone wrong according to conventional, traditional views of how the world should be. It's worth just mentioning that this famous attempt to turn the world upside down and make it a better place, the French Revolution of 1789 to 1794, harked back to the Saturnalia, because the French revolutionaries chose the Phrygian cap as their symbol. The Phrygian cap was the cap that was worn by freed slaves in ancient Rome, so there's a kind of subversive undercurrent that's coming through there. I love this. This is a Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast, the inventor of the Red Father Christmas. Thomas Nast, a cartoon from 1863, and we discover that Father Christmas is part of the struggle against slavery, because there he is dispensing presents to the Union soldiers and dangling a puppet, and the puppet is labelled Jeff. That is Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States of America, the slave-owning states. But here's my favourite example of how Christmas can become subversive. And in preparation for the talk, I read what is the best study of the Christmas Truce, because there's a lot of myths told about the Christmas Truce in 1914, and I can tell you that this was not one or two isolated incidents on the Western Front on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and Boxing Day, on the Western Front of the First World War in 1914. It was a huge movement of fraternisation that affected at least 2/3 of the 27 miles of British line. They stopped fighting along 2/3 of the 27 miles of the British line. It was initiated by the Germans, interestingly. The Germans celebrating Christmas traditionally with enthusiasm, singing carols, in particular singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night, and putting Christmas trees on the parapet in front of their trenches, and they would then be calling to each other, because the trenches were often 25, 50, 75 yards apart. They'd be calling to each other, and they would be singing in one trench, and then they would sing a carol in the other trench, and so on. And so relationships were created that led to men, thousands and thousands of men on Christmas Day coming up onto their parapets, which normally would be instant death on the Western Front, and moving across no man's land to meet in the middle. The image we've just seen is a reconstruction painting at the time, but these are genuine photographs taken by fraternising soldiers on the Western Front on Christmas Day in 1914, officers depicted in the top, and these are rank and file soldiers that you can see down here. Many of the soldiers sent letters back. Many of the letters were published in the press. This is a press article which appeared shortly after the fraternisation. This fraternisation was a result of the fact that the guys in the trenches were having very similar experiences, and there was a kind of a solidarity that was born of that shared experience. And of course, the longer they spent in those trenches, the more they came to realise that they had no real issue with the guys in the other trenches. It was the beginning of the process of the breaking down of the nationalism that would eventually explode into revolution in 1917, when Live and Let Live, which is this tradition that developed in the trenches of not shooting at them so that they don't shoot at us, this tradition of Live and Let Live exploded into full-scale revolution and wholesale fraternisation at the front, and an attempt, again, to turn the world upside down. That's the real message of Christmas. We need to be trying to turn the world upside down for good, not just for a day. There you go.